So we're going to get started, folks, just because we have to make a few announcements before. Thanks for coming. Telling Gary that it's a quality crowd today, right? Thanks for coming. Now, often we're downstairs. I prefer this room because you have a little more control of the sound and such, but it's also nice to be downstairs. So I think many people know Gary Hughes, who introduced him in the SAC. But we just want to, I think a lot of you already know this because some of you have already contributed and helped spread the word. So we're involved with bringing the sword home, Dr. Stevenson's sword. And so that's, there's 2 or 3 different ways you can contribute. You can contribute to GoFundMe. You can also contribute by sending, if you want to make an online donation to Canada Helps. You can talk to me or Troy after. Canada Helps, and that's a Canadian funding site. And you can put in your donation. This donation is going to the Sword Fund, and that donation will automatically trigger a CRA receipt. We also, Troy and I now think that we can write people who donated through here. We can also write you charitable receipts, right? So we might be contacting you for addresses, things like that. The other way you can give money is just the old-fashioned way: is give me or Troy or any board member cash or a check, and we can write you a receipt, CRA receipt. So we've got about half the money raised now, just under half. We're meeting with the 7,000-ish.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything else about the sword before we talk about other stuff?
Well, no, I just wanted to tag on. Dr. Stevenson was regional surgeon for the 29th Connecticut, which is one of the all black units that were raised after the Emancipation Proclamation. The last few days, I've been doing digging into the records, and I've located 3 New Brunswickers that enlisted. Aside from him, but enlisted men in the 29th Connecticut, 1 from Nova Scotia, and about 48 from the rest of Canada. So
These would be black men.
yes,
Yeah.
So let's just so one fella was from St. John. Sorry, I can't remember his name. But I know one specifically has on his enlistment record that he's from St. John, Brunswick. Yeah. So I just wanted to add that. This particular artifact, it has a wider connection to New Brunswick, other than the doctor who's now resting in St. Andrews.
Yeah, so what we're hoping is that people can keep spreading this, that the story will spill over outside of the Maritimes and start to get some attention in Ontario and places like that, right? Because there's a lot more people up there who might have an interest in civil. So the other thing is on February 17th, we're co-hosting with David Goss a heritage fair at the Trinity Church, Charlotte Street entrance. It's not in the church itself, but in that sort of office type, choir practice type room they have on the Charlotte Street side. It's from 10 in the morning. It's Saturday to 3 p.m. There'll be about 10 tables from different groups, including us and the 20th Main. Yeah, New Brunswick is the New Brunswick Genealogical Society, the Provincial Archives, and other tables there. So that's a free event, and there'll be a few things there for sale. And David Goss will be there. I think there's rumor that a certain sea shanty group is going to pop in around 1 o'clock and sing a few family-rated sea shanty songs. Yeah. And,
well, that's a disappointment.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, do we have a date for the next towards the next class?
It'd be the last Saturday of February.
Okay, and that's going to be Harold Wright.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to introduce the speaker in a sec. I want to get try to get. I wanted to get background picture for Hughes. Curator Emeritus at the Brunswick Museum. Very good. 35, 40, 44 years at the museum. So imagine knowledge. And so he's going to read his paper, and we're going to have the phone interview. And we have been, with Gary's permission, Troy is going to film his talk, and we're going to put that video on our YouTube site, and we would just want to remind people that we do have that
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, we do have that YouTube site. So Gary, do you want to use the,
I don't think so.
oh, sorry, yeah, I'm just, you know, I do my brain,
I
yeah.
know I'm a product of that.
No, that's good, that's perfect. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gary.
So, somebody say go.
Yep.
Action.
All right. The title of this paper is something that I worked on a year or so ago. Maybe acquire a copy of it as we go. But the title is the 104th Regiment and the Loyalist Centennial, the establishment of the legend. In 1975, an article by then University of Toronto doctoral candidate Murray Barclay appeared in the spring edition of Acadiensis, entitled The Loyalist Tradition in New Brunswick. His contributions in the 4-year-old Atlantic Regional History Journal followed on several others dealing with the Loyalists. However, take an extended look at their historiography within the province. Whatever the failings of the Loyalist dream to establish a Tory Elysium in the north, his review of 19th and early 20th century literature on the subject reflected the importance to descendants of the Loyalist myth and its development into a tradition. This was intended to outweigh any shortcomings of the dreams through reliance on recurring themes such as their elitist origins, steadfast loyalty to the crown, sufferings on this account, pro- and anti-American sentiment, struggles against nature, and conservative social values. Different elements in this list could emerge or recede depending upon internal conditions and external stimuli. Barclay examined this development from the first history of the province, written by Peter Fisher in 1825, to the beginning of World War I. His intent was to analyze the Loyalist myth while explaining why and when the various aspects emerged. Thus, for example, the state of the economy, levels of immigration, American foreign policy could influence the tone of the Loyalist story. Anniversaries were of special importance in defining the myth. These took place for the most part in the print capital of St. John, and were faithfully reported in local newspapers. 1833 marked 50 years since the landing, and the major event was a public dinner given for all surviving Loyalists in the St. John region. As it was, representation was chiefly the elite of local society, and the speeches mostly pro-American, emphasizing a common heritage with their neighbors, while maintaining the Loyalist steadfast principles, victory over the wilderness, and the ultimate justification of their stand. Though challenged by other elements of society, the Loyalist elite remained in control, their family compact still with firm grip on the province's political offices and machinery. The late 1830s brought a decade of change to the province and the myth. Economic depression followed the panic of 1837. American manifest destiny on the continent was expressed locally during the Brunswick War of 1839-41 over the western boundary of the province, and serious fires devastated the waterfront in South St. John in 1837 and 1841. Battered economically, the Loyalist elite's numerical place in society was then threatened by massive immigration of Irish capitals, while timber barons and a rising urban core of manufacturers had tested their political dominance. In response, the Loyalist myth received more wattage, and in particular, the Anglophone connection of loyalty to the British Crown was combined with a strong anti-American accent. This was especially articulated by the writings of Thomas Hill in his newspaper, The Loyalist and Conservative Advocate, wherein he chastised the outrages committed by patriots, or as he termed them, sanguinary land pirates. That was a good one. Against defenseless loyal Americans during the Revolution. And so it went, decade by decade. The 1850s, a time of busy shipyards, railroad construction, reciprocity, and friendly relations with the United States. In the 1860s, dominated by Confederation. During these years, the Loyalist myth shrank to the background. The 75th anniversary of the landing at Market Slip barely recognized, and the St. John Morning News in 1862 observing that the Loyalist Day anniversary celebration, quote, appears to be dying out. Unquote. Revival came during the American Centennial celebrations of the mid-1870s, which ignited a desire by New Brunswickers to emulate the patriotic feeling south of the border. Looking to their own Centennial in 1883, Loyalist descendants in the province thought of their forefathers as founding not just New Brunswick, but Canada. It was an easy step to equate the two, the original Loyalists far enough in the past to allow the myth to harden into tradition, with application not just as occasion demanded, but in everyday life. The Centennial would mark a watershed moment for this elite group of provincial society, which had come to interpret the prosperity of the mid-Victorian period as a sign of divine favor and justification of their cause. Going one step further, sermons from various pulpits began comparing the Loyalists to God's chosen people in the wilderness. While this suggested a descent into dogma, the founding of the New Brunswick Historical Society in 1874 at least forced the appearance of serious research into Loyalist history, though it would in no way endanger the mythic structure that had been created. Barclay portrays the Loyalist Centennial period as one where pro-American sentiment was strong. Addresses and sermons emphasized the disappearance of any residual bitterness during the past century, and Mayor Simeon Jones was quoted as saying that, quote, we are now practically as one, unquote. The spirit of the celebrations, the rise of the new St. John following the Great Fire of 1877, and the absence of any major irritant of cross-border relations, no doubt contributed to this feeling. There was, however, an undercurrent of separate opinion. Barclay did not report the three-part series published in the St. John Daily Telegraph in mid-April 1882, which closely documented the campaign seasons of New Brunswick's 104th Regiment of Foot in Upper Canada in 1813 and 1814. In an introduction to the series, it was observed that New Brunswickers were proud of the regiment's part in the War of 1812, noting that their famous march to Upper Canada beginning in February 1813 was well known, but their operations once there were not. The series described these campaigns in detail, including the battles of Sackett's Harbour, Lundy's Lane, and Fort Erie, while taking generous swipes at the American version of events, most notably Benson J. Lossing's pictorial field book of the War of 1812, calling it, quote, a gilded fraud, unquote, and terming his version of Lundy's Lane, quote, so abominably false that it is not even consistent with itself. Quote. Amongst Lossing's heresies were his contention that the British Army was largely composed of Wellington's veterans from the Peninsular War. The British outnumbered the Americans, and worst of all, the Americans won. At the conclusion of the series, a note under the heading, the 104th Regiment expressed the opinion that many readers would keep the articles for future reference, since they were sure to, quote, develop and sustain the spirit of patriotism and nationality. Although this version of the war had its lapses in balance and exaggerations, Barclay employed his own spin on the nature of the conflict and the 104th part in it. This was initially extrapolated from Fisher's history and his account of the Loyalist struggles against nature. While Fisher makes no mention of the war, Barclay nevertheless concludes that New Brunswickers lacked the illustrious militaristic tradition of the War of 1812, which Upper Canadians possessed in the myth of Isaac Brock and the militia legends. And further that New Brunswick did not experience any threatened or real American aggression. Instead, nature was the enemy of the Loyalist efforts to create a British colony in the north. Nature, and not the Americans, was also the main enemy of the 104th during the war, since the only event mentioned concerning New Brunswick's Loyalist sons' participation in the War of 1812 was the winter march of the 104th from Fredericton to Quebec. Today, we know the lack of threatened or real American aggression would have come as news to those members of the 104th militia units, Royal Engineers, and artillery, and ordinary citizens who prepared such a strong network of defenses around the province after the declaration of war in June 1812, or those who felt the sting of American privateers in the Bay of Fundy and its shoreline. There is less excuse concerning the American enemy in Upper Canada, given the articles in the Telegraph and the New Brunswick historian James Hannay's The War of 1812, published in 1901. One of the few histories of the war from an Anglo-Canadian perspective, including the battle history of the 104th. Though within the author's timeline, neither source is mentioned. Instead, Barclay keys on the only seeming ripple of discord within the prevailing warm atmosphere between the United States and Canada during the Centennial period. This involved a controversy surrounding a fitting memorial to the Loyalists. There were two schools of thought, one lobbying for a memorial hall and one for a monument. As reported in the Telegraph, the monument faction was led by the distinguished St. John lawyer David Shanks Kerr, who proposed a granite pillar on the site of the former bell tower at the head of King Street, which had been destroyed in the Great Fire. It would, he said, quote, present a lasting tribute to the history and worth of the noble Loyalists and the heroic deeds of their noble sons in the War of 1812. These Loyalist sons were, of course, the 104th, when the term recalls Barclay's reference and likely its source. Kerr's proposal was read at a Citizens Committee meeting of the Mechanics Institute on 15th August 1882, and included a short account of the regiment's history in Upper Canada. There were about 100 people in attendance, including executive officers and members of the Brunswick Historical Society and of the Mechanics Institute, sometimes one and the same. Kerr's idea received mixed support. Several of the executive and regular members opposed the monument, referring to it as J.W. Lawrence did as a, quote, petrified idea. To this faction, a memorial hall, including a library, museum, art gallery, and dedicated area of remembrance to the Loyalists, was seen as more suitable. But the monument proposal was also strongly supported. The patron of the Historical Society, Supreme Court Judge William J. Ritchie, was behind it, as were two other high-profile judges, Vice Sheriff James Harding and notably the Honorable Samuel Leonard Tilley, then Federal Minister of Finance in the neighboring province. Most important in this instance, however, was then Assistant Editor of the St. John Telegraph and Historical Society member James Hannay. Hannay had seconded Kerr's motion, and indeed it was a family affair. Kerr was his uncle, and Hannay had articled in the News Law Office at the start of his career before switching to journalism. It is also very likely that Hannay was the author of a three-part series in the Telegraph on the 104th in mid-April, and also the moving force behind the monument proposal. He would later write History of the Loyalists, a 37-chapter serialized publication appearing in the pages of the Telegraph between January and September 1893, and followed that up with the War of 1812. Both displayed a healthy anti-American sentiment, and while fellow New Brunswick historian William Lofter Raymond thought this beyond the pale, at least in reference to the Loyalist history, he also noted that it was a, quote, wholesome antidote, unquote, to the saintly regard usually given patriots south of the border. In the end, neither side triumphed. There was no memorial hall, art gallery, or museum. The monument was raised in King Square, though not to quote the memory of the noble Loyalists and their sons of the 104th, but rather to the sacrifices endured by Loyalist women. This was not inscribed in any meaningful fashion, and its significance was probably long lost by the time it was removed in the 1950s after years of deterioration. For his part, Barclay is merely satisfied that the New Brunswick Historical Society had voted down Kerr's pretentious column, quote, dedicated to non-existent Martian values. while, again, contrasting the New Brunswick Loyalist tradition with its militaristic counterpart in Upper Canada. With so much warm regard being spilled between the two nations during the celebrations, it is instructive to compare this opinion with the reaction of two members of the Historical Society opposing the statue at the original meeting of the Citizens Committee. One, Secretary W.P. Dole, argued that, quote, any recognition of the gallant deeds of our native troops in the War of 1812 would be offensive to our American friends, unquote. Another, William Best, stated rather incomprehensibly that, quote, Americans were ashamed of the Bunker Hill Monument, unquote. This drew contrary responses from Supreme Court Judge A.L. Palmer and George King, the latter opining that, quote, he could not agree with Mr. Dole's idea that recognizing the heroes of 1812 would be improper or offensive to the United States. We were, he observed, not called upon to apologize to anyone for whatever his heroic in that war. There was no response to Mr. Best's assertion. It would seem in retrospect that a portion of the opposition to the monument, at least, was more fearful of strained relations with the Americans than any deep-seated belief in the non-existent martial values of the Brunswickers. In any event, the failure to build either the military home or a home did not detract from the various parades and processions, a principal feature of the Centennial celebrations. These were transitory, but carried forward many memories for participants and spectators. The main event was a depiction of the landing of the Loyalists at Market Slip, timed to meet a procession of various groups who represented later aspects of New Brunswick's history, ranging from the 1780s to the present day. Significant amongst these was the reenactment unit of the 104th, possibly inspired by the recent controversy. Barclay characterized some aspects of the celebration as a farcical burlesque, based on the observations of one bystander, because some participants were not stern and brave enough. This assessment was probably correct if limited to the last segment of the parade, because it was dominated by the Calathumpians, a group which promoted a burlesque tradition of anti-respectable street theater and civic parades during the last half of the 19th century. As Bonnie Huskins has shown in her doctoral thesis on public celebrations in St. John and Halifax at this time, the working-class Calathumpians differed from another group, the Polymorphians, who saw themselves as upwardly mobile and paraded in a much more respectful manner. It was this group that represented the 104th, and did so, according to Huskins, with a sense of local pride and patriotism. A photograph of the reenactors forming up in Haymarket Square on the east side of the city suggests a fair amount of effort went into the portrayal. I think we have a slide we move on with that. I'll continue to What appears to emerge from the monument controversy and his nuclear articles and the reenactors is that by 1983, at least, there existed an almost de facto acknowledgement of the 104th as New Brunswick's Regiment. The Royal Provincial Regiments arriving in the province from New York after the Revolution were too numerous to allow a focus on one formation, and it was both easier and logical to unite the 104th and its sons of the Loyalists as their successor, given its engagement with the same enemy in the Second American War within a generation. In this way, it would lend a significant military tradition to the post-arrival history of the Loyalists. It would also be a history that developed and deepened over time, exposing its own myths while still remaining an inspiration to later New Brunswick units in times of war and gaining an international dimension in the 1930s through a successful effort to return the unit's colors to New Brunswick from Scotland. With the bicentennial of the war now upon us, comparison with the illustrious militaristic traditions of Upper Canada may seem a bit rich, but it is certainly a record of which we can be proud. Thank you. That may have inspired some questions. We'll see what I can deal in terms of those. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So the 104th origin was, they were militia groups, essentially. actually out of this territory from the Pennsylvania.
That's right, yeah.
And, but it had a pre-origin to that, did it not, in England, or am I incorrect?
It may well have been, I wouldn't know, it could well have been, you know, I didn't study that aspect.
It started out as the New Brunswick Fenceful Unit,
Right.
and I believe it was in 1810, the officers and men petitioned the British government to adopt them as a line unit. So that's when they became the 104th, because they wanted to go to Europe and fight Napoleon, but then the Americans had different ideas. But they, yeah.
So just a follow-up to that, do you happen to know, or have you, any of your studies ascertained who these collection of men were? Were they all, were there some black, were there some Francais, or were they all from the, basically that time period?
Yeah.
Most of it, I appreciate, from the colonies that have been alive here.
I think there was some blacks in the regiment. I don't know how many. I'm not sure about the French element in it at all. That's possible.
Is anybody written a definitive?
Not that I know of, you know.
Read Mary Hart's Make Light Days. It's the war journal of Lieutenant John Lacouture, who was a British officer, a young officer, that was appointed to the 104th basically a couple of months before the war broke out. And he talks about the multicultural makeup of the unit. He's talking about not only the men from the Atlantic provinces that joined up. They're used to it, but then he was talking about the hardiness of the Irish and the Scots that joined, and that sort of thing. And there was also a number of Acadians that were in that unit as well. Yeah. It's a good book. One of the interesting stories he tells in his book is he's officer of the watch in December in New Brunswick. He comes across a young sentry in the middle of the night that's slurring his words and staggering around. He charges him for being drunk on duty, ends up having the poor guy flogged, but then after he spends a couple of winters in Canada, he says the poor bugger was probably froze, he wasn't drinking, and he felt sorry for it afterwards. That's just one of the little anecdotes he puts in there, but he tried very hard to make Light Days.
And then I guess another follow-up, if I could, still one more, is in World War II, World War I, we had anything definitive on the 104th of those.
Yeah, no, I haven't done any work on the 104th and World War I, that's for sure. No. Yeah, as you I followed the regular infantry overseas, the 26th, and that sort of thing. Yeah, so it's a question.
I was just curious about the image, Gary. Do you know where the parade grounds is or was and what the...
Oh, Haymarket's there.
That's Haymarket.
Yeah.
So that'd be Hill in the background would be
Yeah.
Waterloo Street, I guess. Or is that Fort Howe?
Towards Lily Lake.
Okay, gotcha, okay.
It's looking north.
Okay.
Gary, you mentioned like the Californians and the polymorphians, so were these the polymorphians? I'm trying to remember.
Polymorph.
Yeah,
These
yeah.
are polymorph.
Yeah, do you have a list of any names from that group?
Not that I know of,
Yeah.
I haven't gotten to that depth yet, but that's an interesting formation.
Yeah. Do you know, can you tell from the photo or anything that, what were they carrying real guns or wooden guns or what were they carrying there? It's kind of hard to tell.
Well, it's kind of hard to tell, it
Yeah.
looks like swords and sticks.
Okay,
As far as I can
yeah.
see.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not very clear or definitive.
And I had another question. I think I've gone through that, you talked about the Hanny's well, he published in the newspapers, but,
Yeah.
you know, you probably know the original type of handwritten
Yeah,
manuscript is in the New Brunswick Museum.
that's right, yeah.
When I read it years ago, it was more like the history of the American Revolution. You know, that I thought that because it went into all these battles and all, you know, so it was it was really over the top. I remember it
Yeah.
was very over the top, you know, and which kind of, as you point out, in his War of 1812 book, which sort of is a counter to this, you know, we're all friends now. And
Yeah,
because in my memory of the War of 1812 book is that throughout it, Annie's taking pot shots at the Americans of that time. He's not just talking about 1780s, right? And he had worked in the States. I think, did he work in Brooklyn or something?
yeah, that's
Yeah.
how, yeah.
Anyway, it's great.
Well, you never know, these border wars.
Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else?
I'll make a small observation. You referenced Justice Ritchie leading some of the arguments for commemoration, and a couple of other members of the judiciary doing that. And that's so very different from our time, when the judiciary seems to stay well clear of the public fray,
Yeah.
except for their pronunciations from the bench. Ritchie, I believe, went on the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah.
And he had been involved in the Alabama, I think, trials during the American Civil War. I think he resigned.
Chesapeake.
Chesapeake, that's what it was, yeah. But, kind of an interesting thing to see the judiciary sort of front and center providing that kind of, what I think we would almost consider to be political leadership.
Yes, that's right.
In our day and time.
Yeah.
And we would all be chagrined to see that sort of thing happening in our time.
Yeah, that's a good point, John, because Gary, you've been through the newspapers many times too. You see a lot of these public campaigns and different things happen in the community where they, you know, they want to have the judge up on the platform, right?
Oh, yeah,
Because he brings,
yeah, authority.
yeah, yeah.
And that was part of the letter writing to them, sure.
Gary talked about all of this as relevant to them remembering the Loyalists and commemorating the Loyalists. Are there actually any existing commemorations in New Brunswick today to the 104th itself? Have they been physically
Yes, in
recognized?
Fredericton. In Fredericton, there is a national memorial on Queen Street. You wouldn't be able to miss it.
Evidently, I did.
I'm trying to describe it to you. Yeah, it's there.
Yeah, it's an obelisk in, Officer Square
Okay.
in Fredericton, just outside the museum. And then on the old barracks, there's a plaque, brass plaque that's been there for decades.
I think I've seen that, because I
But,
don't die there,
But for the Centennial of the War of 1812, there was an obelisk put up in Officer Square for the 104th.
Did they do reenactment in 2014 with Bicentennial? 2015?
There was, they reenacted March. It was actually, to the best of my knowledge, and you probably know better than me, but I think it was actual current military members.
Yeah, members of the New Brunswick.
They uniformed,
Yeah.
and they did parts of the march up the River Valley
Yeah.
over that winter.
Yeah.
That was my recollection of it.
Seems to me that we also hosted one or more talks, maybe by Gary or someone from the Gray Center. We can go back and check our Facebook site, but I think this society did host one or more.
Yeah, I attended at least one.
Yeah. And Gary, I'm asking this for purely selfish reasons. I thought you did a nice summary of sort of the evolution of the Loyalist myth, you know, but because I have to give a talk in March on Loyalist identity, and I don't know myself, so I'm putting this out to you. How do you think Loyalist identity? You mentioned some of the public celebrations and things like that, and you talk about the changes in the city, and you talk about Irish Catholic, but you also have a lot of British non-Catholic come in, and you know, who presumably intermarried, you know, with that second generation, you know, of Loyalists, and then you had people move to the States, and you know, so just wondering how, you know, of course, when the British Protestants come in, they're, you know, quote, part of the British Empire and all that. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how that might have all played into the mix.
In terms of, that sort of seeping into the body politic of St. John, we don't know how much really the Californians and the Polymorphians occupy in terms of influence. I'm not aware of any study that's been done in those groups effectively. And I think it would be a useful element to deal with for sure. Because, it's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive.
It just keeps timing out.
Oh, it wasn't. It was a good one.
It's one of those 2 beers that you don't use it once in a while, it just comes out.
It gets forgotten.
Yeah, and what you're saying, Bonnie Huskins, it's more like she talks about the events, I guess, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's a quiet crowd tonight. No, it's not. It's ready to explode again.
Well, did they, presumably, they took part in a big parade, or was it just a one-off for this group,
Yeah, that's right. They would have.
Wow.
American Square.
Yeah.
Yep, it's an interesting element, for sure. And again, understudy.
Yes, yeah.
Understudy.
We've got an expert here who's brain and can keep picking.
Well, don't dig too deep. We did, which was interesting, look at this book that was produced, let's see, 2015 or so. We did have a museum delegation that went out to Sackett's Harbor during the War of 1812 period, and it was interesting because there were, well, you can imagine the Americans were there, but the British were there as well. In terms of a contest within the region's influence of the Atlantic provinces. It's quite an interesting set. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but if you haven't, you can have a look at it. But please, it's the only copy I have left. We had about 100 that we did, and they just disappeared.
So this was maybe explained to someone, they might not know what Sackett's Harbor was.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it was in New York, wasn't it?
In New York.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see this in print, and then to go over the ground that they actually fought. And the Americans were there, of course, as well. So it was an interesting period too.
Was it a reenactor event?
It was a reenactor event.
Okay, yeah, interesting.
Yeah, when they fell, they got up again.
Yeah.
The dead shall rise. It just kept rising.
Yeah. So Gary, what is this talk part of something you're writing?
Well, I don't know. I'm just, I can't really. I know it's not that. I'm not sure exactly what my next project will be.
Right.
These things do take up time. I do have a family, and you can become quite almost a victim of it, but a willing victim.
Well, do we have any final questions or comments for Gary? Any research leads? Anyone have any captured documents at home?
I do remember as a kid, I lived in Beaconsfield area, and you could almost, my father said we moved to the neighborhood to be under the protection of ourselves now. But I remember as a kid, they used to have guys dressed up doing strange drill. And, in the summertime, around, Martello Tower, that's the, ever at Martello Tower. But nonetheless, they had, usually had two guys dressed up. And marching around and greeting the tour buses and tourists and things like that. Of course, they've made use of some of the uniforms that they recreated for inside the tower. The interpretive center has a couple of mannequins. Although I caught them on mistake. That the 104th was the first colonial regiment ever elevated to the British establishment, which of course it wasn't. Anyway, we had a discussion about that. Not yet, because there were a number of during the American Revolution that got elevated to the British establishment, right? Like the American establishment and the Irish establishment.
Well, now that we're telling West Side tales, I almost was one of those guys. But I was 6'2".
Didn't fit into the
16, no. So I got to wear the polyester blazer. Gary, you might remember this because the New Brunswick Museum used to help administer the Carlton Martello Tower before Parks Canada gave us brown sweaters. And I thought, Gary, that the museum at some point found out that we had actual brown dust muskets there that the poor guys were using for bayonets. So I thought that the museum came and liberated some of these back to the collection, right?
Well, I mean, I've been around, obviously I've been at the museum for a long time. I wouldn't doubt some aspect of that.
Yeah, Major Schofield. Yeah. So there was a hand over there.
I was just gonna say, Gary, you mentioned it specifically, but this came out of an amazing exhibit that we did on the bicentennial of the War of 1812 for the museum, which was tremendous. And resulted in a lot of really good nationally important work. The flag that's on the cover here, for example, that's either very correct. Is that the regimental color or the King's colors? I always get the two of them mixed up. Anyway, we undertook with some external partners a major conservation project to have worked on these things which were very close to terminal or shattered silk. They've been through probably no more. They've been through a lot.
That took a long time.
Well, it was, each one was a full year of the Textile Conservators' life, based out of Halifax, and we won the national award from the American Museums Association. It was very instrumental in making that happen, not least of which finding a private donor to make that happen. Who shall remain unnamed.
It's all a team effort.
I've never did that.
Well, we have no more questions. You can certainly hang around here a bit and talk to Gary. We'll just remind you that the last Saturday, in February, is Harold Wright, and he's speaking on another military history topic. It's women who were involved in World War I on the economic side. Is that the topic, Troy?
Yes.
Yeah, and so we'll post, once we get that information from Harold, we'll post that. Don't forget, we have that February 17th Heritage Fair at the Trinity Church, 10 to 3. And then once we know more about what we're doing for March, we'll post that. And we always joke about the rich uncle, but this time we need 2 rich uncles because we're trying to get the funding levels up for that Civil War sword, which is a very exciting project. So thanks for coming, and hope to see you next time at the next event. And if you want to come up and talk to Gary or Troy or whatever, please stay for a few minutes. And thanks for coming.